My name is Julian Cole. I'm 28 years old, and on the exact day I graduated from one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, surrounded by more than 10,000 cheering families, flowers, cameras, laughter, pride filling the air. I was staring down at my phone, reading a message from my mother that made my entire body go cold, because while everyone else was celebrating the people who showed up for them, the 4 VIP seats reserved for my family right in front of me were completely empty. Not delayed, not stuck in traffic, not dealing with an emergency, just empty. And the reason was simple: they chose not to come. They were on a luxury trip in the Bahamas with my younger sister, celebrating her reaching 10,000 followers online. And as I sat there in that heavy graduation robe trying to hold myself together while strangers cheered around me, my phone buzzed again, and I read her message over and over like maybe I misunderstood it the first time. Enjoy your ceremony. We're by the pool. Don't make this a big deal. It's not like you're a real doctor yet. You still have residency. And I remember staring at those words, feeling something very familiar settle in my chest. Not shock, not even anger, just that quiet, numb acceptance I had been carrying for most of my life. Because this wasn't new, this wasn't the first time I had been overlooked, dismissed, made to feel small in moments that should have mattered. It was just the first time it happened somewhere this big, this public, this impossible to ignore. And I thought I would do what I always did: smile politely, get through it, pretend it didn't hurt. But what I didn't know at that exact moment was that something was about to happen on that stage that would change everything, not just for me, but for them too. Before I tell you what happened next, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, just take a second and tell me where you're watching from. Because stories like this hit differently when they feel a little too real. My name is Julian Cole. I'm 28 years old, and on the exact day I graduated from one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, sitting in a stadium packed with more than 10,000 people cheering, crying, celebrating the ones they loved, I was staring at my phone, reading a message from my mother that made my entire body go cold, because while everyone around me was surrounded by support, the 4 VIP seats reserved for my family right in front of me were completely empty, not delayed, not lost, not dealing with an emergency, just empty in a way that felt intentional, deliberate, impossible to explain away. I remember lifting my head slowly, almost like I didn't want to fully accept what I was seeing, scanning the crowd again even though I already knew the truth. Parents standing with flowers, siblings holding signs, people calling out names, cameras flashing everywhere, and then my eyes dropped back to those 4 seats, clean, untouched, painfully visible in a way that made them stand out more than if they had been filled. And in that moment, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sharp enough to break me, just enough to remind me that I should have expected this. Because this wasn't new. It just looked different this time. My phone buzzed again in my hand, and I looked down without really wanting to, like I already knew it wouldn't make anything better. And there it was, a second message, casual, almost effortless, like she was commenting on something small and unimportant. Enjoy your ceremony. We're by the pool. Don't make a big deal out of this. It's not like you're a real doctor yet. You still have residency. And I don't think people understand how something so simple, so casually written, can hit harder than anything loud or dramatic, because it wasn't just the words, it was what they carried. Years of being minimized, dismissed, quietly pushed aside, wrapped into one sentence that confirmed exactly where I stood. I read it again, and then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because part of me was still trying to find a version of it that didn't hurt as much, like maybe if I looked at it long enough the meaning would change, but it didn't. It stayed exactly the same, cold, distant, final. Around me the ceremony continued, names being called, applause rising and falling like waves, people standing up, hugging, crying, capturing moments they would remember for the rest of their lives, and I sat there in the middle of all of it feeling completely separate, like I was watching something through glass instead of being part of it. And I realized something in that moment that I had spent years avoiding. It wasn't that my family didn't understand how important this was, it was that they understood and still chose not to be here. And that difference matters more than people think. Because when someone doesn't show up because they can't, you can forgive that, you can explain it, you can hold on to something. But when they don't show up because they don't want to, there's nothing left to hold on to. I shifted slightly in my seat, adjusting the heavy doctoral robe that suddenly felt tighter than it had a few minutes ago, like it was pressing down on me instead of resting on my shoulders, and I tried to focus on the stage, on the ceremony, and on anything that would keep me from going back to that message again. But my mind kept pulling me back, not just to that moment, but to all the moments before it that led here. Because this wasn't just about today. This was a pattern. A quiet, consistent pattern that had followed me for most of my life. Moments where I told myself it wasn't that bad, that maybe I was overthinking, that maybe next time would be different. And I realized sitting there that I had spent years minimizing things that actually mattered, shrinking my own experiences just to make them easier to carry. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, steady on the outside, but I could feel the tension underneath, the kind you don't show because you've learned how to hide it too well, and for a second I thought about standing up, walking out, disappearing before my name was called, because what was the point of being there if the people who were supposed to care the most weren't even present? But I didn't move. I stayed. Because some part of me, even after everything, still wanted to finish what I started, still wanted to walk across that stage, not for them, not anymore, but for myself, for every version of me that kept going when it would have been easier to stop. And that's the part people don't always see when they look at moments like this. They see the achievement, the title, the recognition, but they don't see what it cost to get there. They don't see the nights where you question everything. The times you keep going without support, the way you slowly learn how to stand on your own even when you never planned to. If you've ever had a moment where something that should have been the happiest day of your life felt unexpectedly heavy, like something was missing that you couldn't replace, then you probably understand this feeling more than you think. Because it's not just about what's happening around you, it's about what's not there. And in that stadium, surrounded by thousands of people, what wasn't there was louder than everything else combined. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers, names being called one after another, each one followed by applause, and I tried to focus, tried to stay present, but my mind kept drifting, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, pulling me back through memories I hadn't fully processed until now, small moments that didn't seem important at the time but suddenly felt connected, like pieces of something I hadn't wanted to see clearly before. I realized then that this moment wasn't just disappointing. It was clarifying. Because for the first time, there was no excuse left, no misunderstanding, no way to soften it or explain it away. Just a simple, undeniable truth sitting right in front of me. And even though it hurt, even though part of me still wanted it to be different, another part of me, the part that had been growing quietly for years, finally accepted it. And sometimes acceptance doesn't feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like something ending. Before I tell you what happened next, and why this moment didn't end the way anyone expected, take a second and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this aren't just mine. They belong to anyone who has ever had to learn the hard way what it really means to stand alone in a room full of people. Part 2 Familiensystem. Linmach. I grew up in one of those neighborhoods where everything looks perfect from the outside. Clean streets, large houses, carefully maintained lawns, families that smile at the right moments and say the right things. But inside my house there was a system, never spoken out loud but followed by everyone, a silent scoreboard that decided who mattered and who didn't. And my father, Richard Cole, treated our family like one of his business investments. Attention wasn't given freely, it was earned, measured, calculated based on what you brought back in return. My mother wasn't any different. She just played a different game. Her entire world revolved around status, appearances, social circles where image mattered more than reality. And in that world there was only one person who truly fit, my younger sister Vanessa. She was everything they wanted to show the world. Effortless charm, perfect timing, always knowing what to say, how to look, how to be seen, and in our house being seen was everything. I, on the other hand, learned very early how to stay quiet, how to stay focused, how to disappear into things that didn't require attention. Books, studying, structure, because I didn't belong in their world, and they made sure I understood that without ever saying it directly, and the difference in how we were treated wasn't subtle, it was constant, woven into every small moment until it became normal. If you've ever felt like you had to earn your place in your own home, you already know how that changes you. You stop asking, you stop expecting, and eventually, you stop hoping. That night, after my graduation, I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again like my mind refused to accept what had already happened. The empty seats, the message, the sound of applause I couldn't fully feel, and the strange realization that no matter how far I had come, I was still standing alone at the finish line. At some point around 3 a.m., I got up and walked into the kitchen. The house was silent. Everyone else was asleep, wrapped in the comfort of a life I never quite felt part of. I opened the fridge, took out leftovers, and stood there, eating cold food straight from the container. Not because I was hungry, because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling sitting in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter, heavier. Acceptance. But acceptance doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means you've stopped expecting things to change. The next morning, life didn't pause for me. It never does. My phone was already filled with messages from classmates, professors, even a few distant relatives congratulating me. But none of the names I was secretly waiting for appeared. No missed call. No apology. No, we're sorry we missed it. Just silence. And that silence said more than any message ever could. By the afternoon, I made a decision I didn't fully understand at the time. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I walked through the campus alone, still wearing a part of my graduation outfit, holding the diploma folder tightly under my arm like it could disappear if I let go. People passed by, smiling, taking photos, celebrating. Life moving forward. Mine felt paused in a strange way. Not broken. Just redefined. When I finally got home later that day, I found Vanessa in the living room. She was filming again. Always filming. My mother was adjusting the lighting, while my father was sitting nearby reviewing something on his tablet. No one looked up when I walked in. At first. Then my mother noticed me and gave a small wave without stopping what she was doing. "Oh, you're back. How was it?" she asked casually. Not curious. Not emotional. Just routine. I stood there for a second, still holding my diploma folder. "It was fine," I said. That was all I could manage. My father didn't even look away from his screen. "Good," he said flatly. "Now you can focus on something practical." Practical. That word again. As if what I had just achieved wasn't already the result of years of discipline, sacrifice, and exhaustion. Vanessa finally turned around, holding her phone. "Did you get a speech or something?" she asked, half interested. "Yes." "Cool," she said, and went back to recording herself smiling. That was it. That was the entire conversation about the biggest moment of my life so far. No celebration. No questions. No acknowledgement that anything meaningful had happened. Later that night, I sat in my room, still wearing the weight of that day. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had avoided for years. Maybe I was never part of the center of this family. Maybe I was just orbiting it. Useful when needed. Invisible when not. A quiet presence they could ignore until it became inconvenient. And somehow, that hurt more than outright rejection. Because rejection at least acknowledges you exist. That night, I heard laughter downstairs. They were celebrating something again. Not me. Vanessa. Apparently, she had reached a milestone online. A few thousand followers. My mother had already ordered decorations. My father had arranged a small dinner reservation. I remember sitting in my room listening to it all, thinking how quickly attention could shift depending on what was considered valuable in this house. A degree that took years of sacrifice. Silence. A social media number that took weeks. Celebration. It didn't feel fair. But fairness wasn't really the system we were living in. The next day, I tried something different. I went to my parents after dinner, holding something I had prepared carefully. My acceptance letter into a volunteer hospital program. It wasn't medical school yet, but it was a major step forward. Something real. Something undeniable. I remember standing in the dining room, waiting for them to finish talking before I spoke. When there was finally a pause, I placed the paper on the table. "I got accepted into a hospital training program," I said. My voice was steady. more confident than I felt. This is the next step toward medical school. My mother glanced at it briefly. Oh, she said. That's nice. Then she turned back to her phone. My father picked it up, scanned it for maybe 2 seconds, then placed it down again. You're still doing that medical thing? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly. Just don't overcommit yourself. You always take things too seriously. That was it. No pride. No curiosity. No understanding of what it took to get there. Just a warning not to overdo it. Vanessa didn't even look up. And in that moment, something inside me shifted again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Permanently. I realized I had been waiting for the wrong kind of recognition. Because in this house, effort wasn't what mattered. Visibility was. And I was never going to be visible in the way they valued. Later that night, I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. No phone. No music. Just silence. And I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. I would stop waiting for them to understand. I would stop trying to explain my life in a language they refused to learn. If I was going to become something meaningful, it would have to be without their approval. Without their validation. Without their permission. Because I was slowly realizing something I didn't want to admit before. The people who are meant to support you don't always recognize your value, even when it's right in front of them. And waiting for them to change was its own kind of prison. I didn't know it then, but that decision was the beginning of everything that would come next. Because once you stop waiting for approval, you start building something entirely different. Something no one can take away from you. I remember one moment so clearly because it explained everything without needing words. Vanessa entered a school talent show. Nothing extraordinary. Her performance wasn't perfect, her timing was off in places, but she placed third, and you would have thought she had just won something global by the way my father reacted. He stood up clapping like the entire room should follow him, proud in a way I had never seen directed at me. The next night he organized a celebration. Not small, not simple. A full private dinner at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Dozens of guests. A custom cake with her face on it. Speeches about her future, her potential, her star quality. And I sat there at the end of the table quietly eating, unnoticed, unasked, unnecessary, like I was just filling a chair. 2 years later, it was my turn, except my version didn't look anything like hers. I graduated at the top of my class. Perfect grades, full scholarship, years of work condensed into one moment that should have mattered. I stood on that stage giving a speech about resilience, about building something from nothing, about pushing forward when no one believes in you, and people listened, they applauded, some even stood, and for a brief moment I let myself believe that maybe this time would be different. But when I walked toward my parents afterward, my father was on his phone, my mother barely looking up, and the only thing she said to me was that my speech was too long and not engaging enough, that I should try to be more like my sister. And that was it. No celebration, no acknowledgement, just silence on the drive home and the sound of television laughter while I stood alone in the kitchen, eating cold leftovers, realizing something had finally shifted inside me. That night, I stopped trying to be enough for them, and instead I made a decision that would define everything that came after. After that night, something inside me changed in a way I couldn't fully explain to anyone. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was more like a decision that quietly locked itself inside my mind and refused to open again. I stopped waiting. Not just for their approval, but for anything that depended on them. If I wanted something, I would have to earn it alone. No safety net, no backup, no family will help you illusion. Just me. And strangely, that realization hurt less than I expected. Because disappointment has a limit. At some point, it turns into clarity. I threw myself into pre-med studies like my life depended on it. Because in my mind, it did. While other students were building social lives, going out on weekends, posting pictures of parties I would never attend, I was buried in textbooks so thick they felt like walls between me and the rest of the world. Organic chemistry wasn't just a subject anymore, it became survival. Anatomy wasn't just memorization, it became discipline. Every exam I passed felt like proof that I wasn't what my family believed I was. Disposable, replaceable, secondary. But the hardest part wasn't the studying. It was silence. There were days I would sit in the library, surrounded by people laughing softly, eating together, sharing notes, and I realized I had no one to call if I failed. No one to say good job. No one to even notice if I stopped showing up. That kind of loneliness changes you slowly. You stop expecting comfort. You stop expecting encouragement. You stop expecting people to show up at all. Instead, you learn to rely on exhaustion. Because exhaustion at least is consistent. During that time, Vanessa's life moved in the opposite direction of mine. She had officially left school. Not that my parents questioned it. Of course they didn't. To them, education was something you invested in if it looked promising. Otherwise, it was optional. Vanessa announced she was going to become a lifestyle influencer. That was the word she used. Influencer. It sounded harmless, modern, creative, but what it really meant was curated life, filtered reality, and constant validation from strangers online. My parents loved it immediately. Suddenly, there were new cameras in the house, new lighting equipment, new clothes arriving almost every week. My mother started talking about branding like it was a family business. My father called it future potential. I remember sitting at the kitchen table once, watching Vanessa take photos of her coffee cup for almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Just to make a cup of coffee look effortless. And my mother was standing next to her, smiling like this was success. I remember thinking, this is what they invest in. Not effort. Not discipline. Not years of sacrifice. But visibility. One evening, I came home late after volunteering at the hospital. My scrubs smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. I was barely keeping my eyes open. Vanessa was in the living room filming a short video. My mother was holding the camera. My father was reviewing something on his phone. No one noticed me at first. And when they did, it was my mother who spoke without even looking up. "You're late again, Julian. Try not to bring that hospital smell into the house." I stood there for a second. Hospital smell. That was her way of describing the place where I was learning how to save lives. I nodded once and went upstairs. No argument, no reaction. Because I was learning something important by then. Not every battle deserves your energy. Some rooms are already decided before you speak. But the real shift happened a few months later. I had been accepted into a more advanced pre-med research program. It wasn't medical school yet, but it was competitive enough that most students in my year didn't even qualify. When I told my parents, I expected nothing. But part of me still hoped for something. A note. A pause. Maybe even a question. Instead, my father said, "That sounds like a lot of pressure. Are you sure you're not overdoing it?" And then he turned back to his phone. My mother added, "You should consider something more balanced. Not everything needs to be so intense." Balanced. That word. As if ambition was something dangerous. As if wanting more than silence was a flaw. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood something clearly. They were never going to step into my world. Not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. The next morning, I went to the hospital for my volunteer shift earlier than usual. A pediatric ward. Children recovering from surgery, some waiting for diagnoses, some just trying to smile through pain they didn't understand. I spent hours there without realizing time was passing. There was a boy, maybe 7 years old, who kept asking when he could go home. No one had an answer yet, but he kept smiling anyway. At some point, I sat beside him and helped him draw. He didn't ask about my life. He didn't care about grades or status or family expectations. He just asked if I liked superheroes, and I said yes. Because for a moment, I wanted something simple. That night, when I left the hospital, I stood outside for a long time before going home. The air was cold, quiet, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I was running toward anything. I just felt steady. That was the beginning of it. Not success, not achievement, but direction. Because I realized something important. I wasn't studying medicine to prove anything to my family anymore. I was doing it because I had already seen what it looks like when someone is completely powerless, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who walks away from that. Even if no one ever clapped for me. Even if no one ever came to my graduation, even if my seat stayed empty in every important moment of my life, I would still show up for others. That became my decision. Quiet, final, unshakable. And I didn't know it yet. But that decision was about to lead me into a path that would change everything. Because sometimes life doesn't reward you immediately. Sometimes it just waits until you're ready for the moment that breaks everything open. And mine was coming sooner than I thought. If they refused to see me, then I would become impossible to ignore, not by asking louder, but by becoming better, stronger, undeniable. And that's when I chose my path, pediatric surgery, one of the hardest roads I could take. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I needed to prove something to myself. From that moment on, my life became discipline. Long nights, endless studying, volunteering at hospitals, watching doctors work, learning everything I could, pushing past exhaustion because I knew this was my way out, my only way out. And while I was doing all of that, Vanessa chose a completely different path. She dropped out, became an online lifestyle influencer, and my parents supported her without hesitation, funding everything: her apartment, her equipment, her life, while I worked exhausting shifts just to survive. But I told myself it would be worth it, because one day I would reach a point they couldn't ignore, and that moment came when I received my acceptance into one of the top medical programs in the country. I remember dropping to the floor crying, not quietly, not controlled, just releasing everything I had been holding in for years, because this meant something. This was proof. I took that letter home, sat at the table, hands shaking, waiting for pride, for recognition, for anything, and instead my father pushed the folder back toward me without even opening it, saying they couldn't take the financial risk, that I should consider a different path, while in the same breath they invested thousands into Vanessa's new business idea. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break, it ended. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just picked up my future, put it back in my bag, and walked out of that house, knowing one thing with complete clarity: I was on my own, and if I wanted this life, I would have to fight for every part of it without them. The next years were brutal: high-interest loans, working overnight as an EMT, surviving on almost no sleep, studying between emergency calls, living in a constant state of exhaustion that most people would never understand. But I kept going. Not because it was easy, but because stopping meant losing everything I had already sacrificed. And then one night, completely drained, I fell asleep over a textbook in a hospital break room where I wasn't even supposed to be, and when I woke up, Dr. Evelyn Carter was standing over me, watching, evaluating, seeing something no one else ever had, and that moment, as simple as it looked, became the turning point of my entire life. Because for the first time, someone didn't just notice me, they recognized me. And that changed everything. I remember the exact moment my name echoed through the stadium speakers, and for a second, everything felt unreal, like I had stepped outside my own life and was watching it happen to someone else. Valedictorian, Dr. Julian Cole. The word doctor landed differently that day. Not like a title, not like an achievement, but like something I had dragged myself toward through years of exhaustion, silence, and being overlooked. I stood up slowly. My legs felt heavier than they should have. Not because I was weak, but because of everything they carried. Every sleepless night, every shift on that ambulance, every time I told myself to keep going when quitting would have been easier. And still, when I turned my head slightly, those 4 empty seats were there, untouched, waiting for people who had already decided I wasn't worth showing up for. I walked toward the stage anyway, because that's what you do when you've come this far. You don't stop, even when it hurts. You finish. But just as I reached the steps, something unexpected happened. Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped forward again. She wasn't supposed to speak anymore. Her part was done. The program was clear, structured, timed down to the second, but she stepped back to the microphone anyway. And the way she looked out at the crowd, it wasn't formal anymore. It was personal. "I need to say one more thing," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The entire stadium went quiet almost instantly, because when someone like her speaks, people listen. She turned slightly, not fully toward me, but enough. There are people in this world, she continued, who will only value what is easy to show, what looks impressive on the surface, what earns them attention. A pause. And then, there are people who build something real, quietly, without applause, without support, without recognition. I felt my chest tighten. She wasn't reading from anything. This wasn't part of the plan. This student, she said, did not have the advantage of being celebrated at every step. She was not given comfort. She was not given safety. She was not given the kind of support most people in this stadium take for granted. There were murmurs now. Small shifts in the crowd. But no one interrupted her. Instead, she continued, her voice sharpening just slightly, she was told she was a risk, a liability, an inconvenience. I closed my eyes for half a second. Because hearing those words out loud, in front of thousands of people, it did something I wasn't prepared for. It made it real in a different way. And still, Dr. Carter said, she chose to stay. She chose to fight. She chose to become someone who saves lives, even when no one was saving hers. Silence. Heavy. Complete. If you are sitting here today as a parent, she added, I want you to understand something clearly. Her tone changed. Not emotional. Firm. Your presence matters more than your money. Your belief matters more than your image. And the absence of both leaves a mark that success cannot erase. No one moved. No one spoke. And for the first time in my life, I felt something shift. Not in them. In me. Because for years, I had been carrying something I didn't fully understand. This quiet need to be seen by people who never really looked. And standing there, in that moment, I realized something that felt both painful and freeing at the same time. I didn't need them to see me anymore, because I could see myself. Dr. Carter stepped back. The moment ended, but it didn't disappear. It stayed, like something that had been set into place after years of being loose. I walked across the stage. I took the diploma. I shook hands. The cameras flashed. People clapped. But it wasn't the applause that stayed with me. It was the quiet inside my chest. The kind that doesn't come from emptiness, but from finally understanding something you've been running from. When I stepped down from the stage, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I did. Another message from my mother. Enough with the drama. People are sending us clips. Fix this now. I stared at the screen. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anything. Because something had already closed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just. Completely. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. And I kept walking. Not toward them. Not toward anything behind me. Just forward. After the ceremony ended, families rushed the field. Laughter, photos, hugs, moments being captured, held onto, celebrated. I stood there for a second, watching it. Not with jealousy. Not even with sadness. Just awareness. This is what it looks like when people show up for each other. And I made a quiet promise to myself right there. If I ever built a family, if I ever loved someone deeply enough to call them mine, I would show up, fully. No conditions. No comparison. No silent scoreboards. Because I knew exactly what it felt like when someone didn't. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to pause for a second. Because this part of the story, it's not just about me. It's about something a lot of people don't talk about. The kind of absence that doesn't leave bruises, but still changes you. If any part of this feels familiar to you, I'd really like to hear your story. Not for attention, but because sometimes sharing it is the first step to letting it go. And if you think this story might help someone else feel a little less alone, sharing it could matter more than you think. Now, I wish I could tell you that was the end. That everything got better right after that moment. But life doesn't work like that. Because what happened next, 5 years later, was something I never saw coming. And it brought my family back into my life in a way I wasn't prepared for at all. Not as parents. Not as people I needed. But as something else entirely. Something that forced me to face a question I thought I had already answered. Would I help them? After everything? I didn't walk out of that consultation room angry, and that's what surprised me the most. because 5 years ago I would have been shaking, my voice breaking, my chest tight like I couldn't breathe. But this time, it was different. Something inside me had gone completely still, like the part of me that used to hope had finally gone quiet. I scrubbed in, the water running over my hands, steady, controlled, methodical, each movement automatic after years of repetition. And as the noise of the hospital faded behind those doors, so did everything else, the past, the words, the memories. All of it became irrelevant, because on the other side of that door was a newborn fighting for her life. And in that moment, nothing mattered except her. The surgery lasted 8 hours. 8 long, precise, exhausting hours where every second carried weight, where every decision could mean the difference between life and loss, and I stayed locked in, focused in a way that shuts everything else out. The kind of focus you don't learn from textbooks, you earn it from years of pressure, from nights when you had no choice but to keep going even when your body was done. The defect was severe. The vessels completely reversed. Her oxygen levels dangerously low, but we corrected it step by step, carefully, deliberately, restoring blood flow, stabilizing her tiny heart, until finally, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into a single day, her vitals leveled out. Steady, strong, alive. And just like that, it was over. I stepped back, removed my gloves, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel it, not pride, not relief exactly, something quieter than that, something deeper, certainty. I had done what I came here to do. Not for them, not for closure. Just because that's who I chose to become. I didn't go back to the waiting room. I didn't stand there and watch their reactions. Didn't wait for gratitude or apologies or tears that came too late to matter. I gave the update to the nurse, clear and professional, stable condition, surgery successful, recovery expected, and then I left. Just like that. No dramatic moment, no confrontation, no final speech. Because the truth is, not every story needs a confrontation to end. Sometimes walking away quietly is the strongest thing you can do. If you've ever had to walk away from people you thought would always be there, even when it hurt, even when part of you still wanted them to change, you already understand this feeling. And if that's you, just take a second and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because stories like this aren't just mine, they belong to a lot of us. I drove home that night, with the windows slightly open, the cold air cutting through the silence, and for the first time in a long time, my mind wasn't racing. There were no conversations replaying, no what-ifs, no imaginary versions of how things could have been different. Just quiet, just peace. And I didn't realize how rare that feeling was until I finally had it. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. That's not how real life works. I still had long hours, still had difficult cases, still had days where the weight of what I do pressed down harder than I expected. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't carrying them with me anymore. I wasn't measuring my worth against people who never intended to see it. And once that weight is gone, everything changes. Years passed, not in some dramatic montage, but in small, steady moments, early mornings, late nights, successful surgeries, losses that stayed with me longer than I liked to admit, friendships that grew slowly, naturally, without conditions. I built a life piece by piece, not flashy, not performative, just real. The kind of life where you don't have to prove anything to anyone because you already know who you are. I never unblocked them. Not once. And people ask me sometimes if I regret that, if I ever feel guilty, if I wonder how things could be now, if I had given them another chance. And the honest answer is, no. Because closure doesn't come from other people suddenly becoming who you needed them to be. It comes from accepting that they never will. But here's the part I didn't expect. About a year after the surgery, I heard through someone else that the baby, my niece, was doing well, healthy, growing, laughing. And for a moment, I just sat there with that information, letting it settle, because that was enough for me. I didn't need to see her. I didn't need to be part of their lives. Knowing she was okay, that was enough. Because this was never about revenge. It was never about proving a point. It was about choosing who I wanted to be, even when I had every reason to become something else. And maybe that's the part people don't talk about enough. When you grow up in a family where love feels conditional, where attention is earned instead of given, where you're constantly made to feel like you're not quite enough, it's easy to carry that into everything else. Into your work, your relationships, the way you see yourself. But at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to keep living inside that story or write a different one. I chose different. And if you're still here listening to this, really listening, not just hearing the words but feeling something underneath them, then maybe a part of you is standing at that same decision point too. So let me ask you something. Honestly, if you were in my position, would you have stayed? Or would you have walked away? Because there isn't a perfect answer. There's just the one that lets you breathe again. Family isn't about who shares your blood, it's about who shows up when it matters. Sometimes the hardest choice is also the healthiest one. And choosing yourself is not selfish, it's necessary. This story isn't about cutting people off, it's about knowing your worth and refusing to let it be defined by others. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that you deserve respect, you deserve support, and you deserve a life that feels like your own. Listen carefully, because this was the exact moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that quietly rewrote my entire life from the inside out. When I stepped out of that consultation room, I wasn't shaking, I wasn't angry, and that scared me more than anything, because 5 years ago I would have broken right there, I would have argued, cried, begged for something that was never really mine to begin with. But this time, there was nothing left to fight for. And somehow that felt like freedom. I walked straight into the operating room without looking back, the doors closing behind me, like a line being drawn between who I used to be and who I had become. And as I scrubbed in, letting the cold water run over my hands, something inside me settled into place, steady, controlled, unshaken, because on the other side of that door wasn't my past, it was a newborn child who didn't choose any of this, and in that moment, she was the only thing that mattered. The surgery lasted 8 hours, and I won't pretend it was easy, because it wasn't. It was one of those cases where every second feels heavier than the last, where your mind has to stay sharp even when your body is begging you to slow down, and I stayed there, fully present, fully locked in, correcting what could be corrected, guiding what could be saved, until finally, her heart stabilized, her oxygen levels rose, and for the first time since she was born, her body stopped fighting just to survive. And just like that, it was done. Not a dramatic ending, not a moment where everything suddenly made sense, just a quiet, undeniable truth sitting in front of me. I had saved her, not as a daughter trying to prove something, not as someone chasing approval, but as a doctor who had earned her place one decision, one sacrifice, one sleepless night at a time. I didn't go back to them after that, and I know some people expect a scene there, some kind of emotional confrontation, but real life doesn't always give you that. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away without saying anything at all, and that's exactly what I did. I gave the update to the nurse, kept it professional, kept it simple, and then I left the hospital like it was just another day, even though deep down I knew it wasn't. And if you've ever reached a point in your life where you realize you don't need closure from people who never truly saw you, then you already understand why that moment mattered so much. Because it's not about winning, it's not about proving them wrong, it's about finally choosing yourself without guilt. I thought the hardest part of my life would be surviving everything my family put me through, but I was wrong, because the hardest part wasn't the nights on the ambulance or the exhaustion or even the moment they chose my sister over me. It was learning how to live peacefully after all of it ended, because when you spend years fighting to be seen, you don't realize how loud your mind has become until everything finally goes quiet. I drove home after that surgery, with my hands still slightly trembling on the wheel, not from fear, not from stress, but from the weight of what had just happened, because in one single day I had faced the people who spent years making me feel invisible, and instead of breaking, instead of falling back into who I used to be, I stood there, calm, controlled, untouched, and that realization stayed with me longer than anything else. The strange thing is, I didn't feel victory, I didn't feel revenge, and I definitely didn't feel closure the way people imagine it. What I felt was something much quieter, something deeper, like a door had finally closed inside me without needing to slam. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head trying to rewrite them into something better. I was just done. And if you've ever reached that point where you stop expecting people to become who you needed them to be, then you already know how powerful that silence can feel, because it's not empty, it's freeing. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and life didn't suddenly become perfect. It just became real, steady, manageable in a way it had never been before. I woke up, went to work, focused on my patients, made decisions that mattered, and slowly, without even noticing it at first, I started building something that actually felt like mine. Not something I had to prove, not something I had to defend, just a life that existed without their shadow hanging over it. I built friendships that didn't feel conditional, people who showed up without needing a reason, who didn't measure my worth against anything. And that was something I had never truly experienced before. Because when you grow up in a house where attention is earned instead of given, you carry that into everything. You learn to perform, to overachieve, to prove. But when that pressure disappears, you finally understand what it means to just be accepted as you are. I never reached out to them, not once. And I know some people will hear that and think it's cold, or harsh, or unforgiving. But what they don't understand is that distance isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about protecting the version of yourself you fought so hard to become. Because going back doesn't just reopen communication, it reopens patterns, expectations, wounds that took years to heal. About a year later, I heard through someone else that my niece was healthy, that she was growing normally, laughing, reaching milestones, and for a brief moment I just sat there letting that sink in, because that was enough for me. I didn't need to be part of their lives to know that something good had come out of everything, and maybe that's what made it easier to let go completely, because I wasn't leaving behind something unfinished. I was leaving behind something that had already taken everything it could from me. And here's something I didn't expect to say, but I mean it. I don't hate them, not anymore, because hate ties you to people just as much as love does, and I spent too many years tied to them already. What I feel now is distance, clarity, and a kind of understanding that doesn't excuse what happened, but also doesn't control me anymore. If you're still listening right now, really listening, not just hearing the words but feeling them somewhere inside, I want you to pause for a second and think about this. How much of your life are you still shaping around people who have already shown you who they are? And how different would things feel if you stopped trying to earn something that was never freely given in the first place? Because that's the truth I had to learn the hard way. Your worth is not something other people get to approve or deny. It's something you carry with you, whether they see it or not. And the moment you stop asking for permission to exist as you are, everything starts to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, in a way that lasts. Family is not defined by blood, but by presence, by the people who choose to stand beside you when it matters most. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away with peace instead of staying with pain. This story is not about blame, it's about growth, about learning to value yourself even when others don't. If you take anything from this, let it be this: you deserve respect, you deserve support, and you deserve a life where you no longer have to fight just to be seen.